Suffice to say, it is great, in my opinion. I am Diinki, and in this series I am going to install different Linux distros. I will create art with them, I will work with them, and use them for a period of time. After that, I am going to compile the information and convey the information to you, as well as grade and rate the operating system in these wonderful categories. Hopefully in an effort to not only inspire you to try the OS, but maybe also entertain. And for the first iteration in this series, I've decided to use or try an OS that has always interested me, yet I've never tried. An operating system that is taken in high regard, and it's been gossiped about endlessly, yet its truth has never been truly revealed. So, I will reveal the truth about this OS. Indeed, I am talking about NixOS. Previously, I used it to create a rice, which has actually been part of this project. So let's begin with some theory. Indeed, NixOS was first released year 2003. At first, it was just released as Nix, a package manager that manages software in a very peculiar way. It is a bespoke package manager, and it's also one that you can use in any operating system. It doesn't have to be NixOS. And the main attraction of Nix is indeed the fact that the entire operating system, the kernel, all of the packages, the drivers, everything, well, it's specified in a configuration file, usually configuration.nix. I can make a configuration.nix file that represents the entire OS, and furthermore, I could just copy that config file and move it to a different computer, run a command, and immediately the two computers are running essentially the same operating system. You can go further. You can have entire desktop environments configured with this system. You could specify modules. You can split up the Nix configuration file and handle things that way. If something breaks with an update, well, just use the older configuration.nix file. This makes it very stable and predictable, and along with being able to move the config files between computers and systems, it also makes it portable. Convenient for developers that want the same environment when building code, or convenient for people that want help in setting up their operating system. Someone can just share a configuration file. That is how the Nix package manager handles things, and how you do things in NixOS. There's two types of methodology when releasing new versions of an OS: rolling releases and static releases. Rolling releases are incremental. With every new change that is verified, you can run the update command for your system and immediately fetch that update. You'll always have the latest software, the latest kernel, at the risk of it being more unstable because they're not tested as heavily. Contrasting that, there is static releases, which is what most people are familiar with. Releases are bunched up, tested, and then released at specific dates. With NixOS, however, you can choose. They provide both models, and whichever you want is the one you can specify in the Nix configuration file. The current stable release of NixOS is version 25.05 with the codename Warbler. I'm not entirely sure why they chose that name, but it is what it is. So with all that said and done, let us move on to chapter number 2. The NixOS website is relatively straightforward. It displays an option to use NixOS or just the package manager Nix. I've downloaded the ISO for NixOS and I burnt it onto a USB stick with this command. I installed Nix on both a partition on my main computer as well as a laptop. Booting from the USB gives you a live view of the OS running directly from the USB, and here you can install it. The installation was very simple. It gives you the option to start directly with many desktop environments such as Plasma, GNOME, Cinnamon, or some others. I chose Plasma on one system. It is a simple and effective installation. And that is where the similarities end with other operating systems. I didn't want to use this desktop environment. I wanted to install SwayFX, and I wanted to configure everything to work with my hardware, my GPU. I wanted to use proprietary drivers, Wayland, all that stuff. And to do those things, I had to not just write a command to install the software, no. I had to edit the configuration.nix file. In fact, I actually made separate modules and I included them in the configuration.nix files. And in those modules, I configured the hardware, set up the software that I wanted, and after I did all of that, I simply ran this command to rebuild the system. Restarted my computer after doing some configuration, and instead of logging into the normal desktop environment, I chose Sway, and everything kinda just worked. But yes, this is an immediate change in how you do things. In Arch, you would just use Pacman or the Arch user repository to install the software, but no, not here. Here everything is structured and you write everything explicitly. And in writing the configuration files, I learned that it's not just a JSON file that specifies the packages. No, Nix, it is a declarative language that's purely functional. You can do a lot of things in these configuration files, and it can get really complicated as well. I haven't learned the ins and outs of it, but immediately I learned the fact that unless you're willing to learn how to use this language, you don't want to use Nix. And if you're not a programmer or at least familiar with editing configuration files, you're not going to want to use Nix, is what I would have said if it weren't for this sponsor of today. Indeed, I'm talking about Brilliant. NixOS is an operating system that does favor people that have knowledge in programming, and Brilliant is an educational service that provides a way for you to learn programming in a very interactive and fun way. You can download the mobile app and immediately start creating a habit out of learning, whether it's programming, science, or mathematics. I myself have been wanting to improve my knowledge in mathematics, so I've used Brilliant for that. And by doing small tasks every day, you can easily build your memory, whilst also learning very important topics. It makes learning not so much a chore anymore, it just becomes a habit of yours. If you use my link or scan the QR code, you can get a 20% discount on the annual subscription. And furthermore, you can of course get started for free, so you can get a taste of what Brilliant is all about. I seldom am interested in such deals, however, Brilliant is a wonderful educational service that I can get behind because I use it. Yes indeed, me choosing to interject with the message from the sponsor. In this moment, I feel like that signifies the difficulty of NixOS. However, it isn't difficult for no rhyme or reason. This learning curve, it's one of those situations where the difficulty actually pays off. You gain valuable tools by utilizing NixOS, and after you've learned how to use it, you start to realize how useful they are. And furthermore, I didn't mind this, I actually liked it. However, for a lot of people, immediately, no, Nix is very complicated. That being said, there's an advantage to this. On my other computer, I didn't want to have to rewrite all the config files. If I had Arch, I would have to manually install everything and set up the config files as well. But no, here I just copied the config files from one computer to the other, ran rebuild. Immediately, the computers were running the same operating system, effectively. This is what I mean by the fact that Nix is portable. It was actually very interesting and nice to have this way of working. I browsed the wiki and used the website to see which packages existed. There's a lot of them. There's over 120,000 packages that Nix has by default. I learned that the learning resources are very easy to understand and they're plentiful. So no problems there, and I really don't have any complaints. If I was a programmer and I wanted to build my software and have it be built on the same system where I can guarantee that there were no missing dependencies, and if someone else wanted to build my open source software, I could just share my OS and say, this is what I built it with. So it's very useful for programmers. And for artists, people can compile a list of configuration files for the software. And in these configuration files, you can also set the software up, share the configuration files, and someone else can use them. It was a breath of fresh air working with Nix, because this isn't how you use Arch at all. Although you can technically also use the Nix package manager on other operating systems, such as Arch, which is fine. However, by installing Nix, you're kind of forced to doing things this way. And I already use Arch, and I would have a lot of pre-installed packages, and it would just be annoying to switch over. So I've mentioned Flakes, but what are Flakes? In Nix, I've mentioned that you can configure your system and packages through config files, such as configuration.nix. Flakes are a feature in Nix that make the package manager more akin to regular programming language package managers by introducing a few new features. A flake.lock file, it locks the versions for the software and dependencies that you have installed. This ensures that unless you run Nix Flake update, everyone that installs your Nix Flake config will get the same versions of all the packages. By using Flakes, and in turn flake.nix instead of configuration.nix, you get to use this slightly new and confusing syntax that lets you specify different package repositories, in other words, different locations where you may install different packages from. You can mix and match repos basically. You can also import other flakes as inputs. This lets you install packages from various sources, which is very useful when you want to install experimental packages that aren't in the main repo, or use other people's flakes that achieve certain behavior. And furthermore, flakes also let you specify the dependencies required to build certain development projects. With Nix, you wouldn't install compilers and development tools globally on your system. No, you would specify them in a flake located in each project. Then you would run nix develop, which will switch to the environment specified in the flake.nix file. This will set up the environment to use the development tools that are specified in the flake.nix file. Now, you can share this flake.nix file with your project to anyone else that wants to work on it, and you can ensure that they will automatically have the same environment with all of the tools. Flakes are extremely great, but they have been a bit problematic. First of all, this syntax can be a bit confusing, to put it lightly. Flakes aren't exactly easy to use, even for a programmer. This sucks considering how important the features that they provide are. In fact, I would go as far as to say that they're actually quite crucial. Albeit they're not impossible to learn, it just takes time. Secondly, flakes are still considered experimental despite being essentially a feature which you really should use if you want to use NixOS to its current potential. There is good news, however. Enabling and disabling flakes is very simple, and once you have enabled flakes, you can simply include your existing configuration.nix files into your new flake.nix file, and nothing more needs to be done. All you have to do is run nix flake update before you run your rebuild command to fetch the latest versions of the packages. For the latest tries that I made where I used NixOS, I had to use flakes in order to get the experimental quick shell UI library in order to create a lot of the designs. All that being said and done, I revel in the enjoyment of games a lot. I play a lot. So how does Nix fare with playing? First, I had to install Steam, so I made a new module for the config file. I called it applications.nix, and in here I installed Steam and Wine and a bunch of things. After that, I rebuilt the system and installed the games that I like to play. On Steam, I enabled Proton, and, after that, everything kind of just worked. Yes, it would be preferable to just be able to install and press play. However, being used to how Linux works, this really isn't a problem at all. Everything worked immediately, and if there was software or games that didn't work immediately and needed some setup, well, I could write that setup in a configuration file and share it with anyone else that might want to use the software. Of course, being Linux, there are some software and games that won't work. Examples are Valorant or League of Legends. I don't know why you would play those games, but if you do, well, consider switching to Linux and stopping. More often than not, though, everything worked. How does Nix fare in the process of creation? Well, first of all, I made a Linux Rise, and with that Rise I did use NixOS. That worked very well. It worked as any other operating system, and in a way I prefer it to Arch because I can share the configuration files for Nix and have people immediately be able to install the entire desktop environment that I made, as opposed to Arch, where you would have to git clone and move the config files and also install everything. Here, you copy-paste the config files, run the rebuild command, and boom, you have the exact same system I have. And if not that, you will at least be able to specifically choose the configuration files that you would want for the RISE. Other productivity things, such as editing or making music or 3D models or art, was also quite okay. I made a productivity.nix file and installed all of the software. Yes, most of the software I use do have native Linux versions because I've, with time, adapted my workflows to work well with Linux. You can do it too, and really the softwares are good enough and don't inhibit you in any way. But indeed, it will take time if you're used to Adobe. Resolve worked perfectly. Bitwig Studio, likewise, worked extremely well. If there's VST plugins that are exclusive to Windows, you can use Yabridge, which is a software which lets you use Windows VSTs in any DAW that runs on Linux. Most VSTs also work well, so no complaints there. And I used Blender to create some 3D artworks and also 2D wallpapers. Everything worked well. If you adapt your workflows to use proper software, well, there's no problem with Nix. Yes, you will have to do more setup than simply installing, which is a disadvantage to Nix. There are other operating systems that are Linux-based which make it a lot easier to install software and configure things. However, after I've configured everything, I can simply copy the configuration files to another computer and immediately have my productivity workflow transposed into a different computer. It's very nice to have that possibility. NixOS being portable is a very good advantage. Another thing I do is programming. I code a lot. And it should come as no surprise that in an operating system where you literally have to program configuration files to create these operating systems that are reproducible, programming would also be very, very good. I installed NeoVim and set it up, made an entire config file that would save my preferences for everything, used a thing called Home Manager to be able to automatically move my configuration files between systems as well, and I programmed a bit, and it was nice. If you're a programmer and you use Windows, do consider using Linux. I promise it will definitely aid you a lot. It's good for coders, and you'll also learn a lot, which is always an added bonus if that's your line of work. I recommend Nix for programmers. How would I rate NixOS in these categories? It is kind of complicated, which makes sense because it is a complicated operating system. But I did try to rate it in a biased way and in an unbiased way. And there is a bit of a twist at the end, so... In terms of popularity and community, I've noticed that it isn't the most popular OS, it is actually kind of underrated. But there's people that use Nix that swear by it as the very good operating system. And the community is in general not toxic. It's also not as memed upon as Gentoo or Arch is, so for better or for worse, it has that going for it. Gaming works flawlessly if you're willing to set the actual operating system up yourself, which is the same thing with productivity. Everything works well after you've learned how to use the operating system. And that learning curve is a bit higher than other OSs. Furthermore, gaming on Nix isn't good because Nix makes it easy. No, it's good because Steam and Valve made it easy with Proton and all that stuff. Interpret that how you will. Personally, after learning Nix, I'm used to this kind of process with playing games or installing software. In terms of difficulty, it is a difficult system. However, it's not difficult for no reason. Unlike Arch, you actually have a very nice and easy to use installer. If you want to use the graphical installer, you can have it be configured to be installed with a modern desktop environment as well, whether it's GNOME or Plasma or Cinnamon, whatever you prefer. So it lets you get started quite quickly actually, and once you have everything installed, you just need to learn how to configure everything. That's the complicated part. Like I mentioned, the Nix configuration file uses a purely declarative functional language, which means you can configure the operating system very, very precisely and to a high degree, but once more, there's a learning curve to that. And because personally the difficulty wasn't an issue, I would actually in turn rate the other categories higher, because I don't mind the negative aspect of it. In fact, I prefer it when you take in hindsight the advantages they provide. the portability and stability and the reusability. So for this operating system where nothing is really concrete, because you configure everything yourself, you're going to have to interpret these ratings yourself to a very high degree. So will I switch to NixOS? Well, I still need to use it more, so that remains to be seen. Maybe in the third installment of this series, I will convey that information. But for now, if you're someone that likes programming or want to challenge yourself and want the challenge to pay off, I do suggest trying out Nix. It's not difficult for no reason. It has some very clear advantages, and so I hope I have managed to convey a concise and relatively good review of this operating system. Anyhow,